Welcome back to the Kingdom Planning Podcast. Over the last three episodes, we have been building a picture. We started with the signals that form beneath the surface when organizational strain is developing. Then we went deeper into leadership load and what it costs the leader carrying it. In Module 3, we looked at what happens when authority and responsibility come apart. Today, I want to follow that thread to one of its most common and most disruptive outcomes. Because when authority is unclear and load is accumulating without a named structure to hold it, something very specific starts to happen to the way decisions move through an organization, or more accurately, the way they stop moving. This episode is about decision bottlenecks. What they are, how they form, what they cost, and what they tend to feel like from the inside before anyone has named what is happening. If your organization has ever felt like it is working hard but not moving as freely as it should, this conversation may help locate why. Organizations rarely stall because leaders lack vision or commitment. That is worth saying again because it runs counter to how most leadership conversations go. When momentum slows, the instinct is to look at the people. Who is underperforming? Where is the misalignment in values or effort? What does the team need to do differently? But more often than any of those things, momentum slows because decisions are accumulating faster than they can move through the leadership structure. The constraint is not the people, it is the flow. Decision bottlenecks develop gradually, usually in healthy environments led by capable people who care deeply about outcomes. A senior leader stays involved to protect alignment. A team defers upward to maintain unity. An approval process that made sense at an earlier stage of the organization continues into a later one without being examined. None of these things are failures in themselves, but over time, the combined effect narrows the path decisions can travel. And eventually, that narrowing becomes the thing that is quietly slowing everything else down. What makes this particularly hard to recognize is that activity remains high. Meetings are still happening. Conversations are regular. Leaders are engaged and present. The organization looks busy, but progress increasingly depends on availability rather than clarity. Work pauses while waiting for confirmation. Initiative slows because uncertainty has not been resolved. And the sense that things require more effort than they should becomes a quiet background reality that nobody knows how to name. Exodus 18:18 says, "This job is too heavy a burden for you to handle all by yourself." If you remember, that's when Jethro said that to Moses before Moses recognized it himself. The concern was not about Moses' character or capability, it was about what the structure was asking of one person and whether that was something the structure could sustain. That same observation surfaces regularly in ministry organizations today, often long after the pattern has already taken root. So don't lose heart, you're in good company. Decision bottlenecks almost always begin as acts of care. A senior leader stays accessible so teams feel supported. A key decision gets reviewed to preserve consistency. Temporary oversight continues longer than intended because the outcomes remained positive and nobody flagged the need to step back. Each of those moments reflects genuine investment in the organization. The problem is not the intention. It is what the pattern produces over time. Gradually, authority patterns shift informally. Teams learn where decisions ultimately land and begin routing uncertainty upward automatically. Not because they were told to, not because they lack capability, but because they have absorbed through experience where the final answer actually comes from. As complexity increases, leaders find themselves involved in decisions that no longer require their direct oversight. The cognitive load expands even while the leadership role on paper remains unchanged. Decision queues form quietly. Timing delays start to feel normal because everyone is busy and the pace feels like the pace of a functioning organization. But the underlying pattern is something completely different. It is also worth noting that bottlenecks often intensify during seasons of growth rather than decline. As a ministry expands, adds programs, or brings on additional staff, the volume of decisions requiring resolution increases. If the authority structure does not keep pace with that expansion, the bottleneck deepens even while the organization celebrates outward momentum. The strain is invisible against the backdrop of visible progress, which is precisely what allows it to go unexamined for so long. Another factor is the absence of explicit decision level frameworks. In many ministry organizations, the question of who decides what has never been formally addressed. Authority is assumed rather than assigned. Leaders operate from general understanding rather than clear definition. When the organization is small and relationships are close, that arrangement often works. When complexity grows, the absence of explicit frameworks creates a friction at nearly every decision point. That friction is rarely traced back to where it actually came from. Every leadership system operates within practical limits, even when those limits go unnamed. Threshold signals appear when decision demand approaches or exceeds what the current structure can absorb. These signals rarely announce themselves dramatically. They surface instead as a gradual shift in how leadership feels from the inside. A senior pastor or executive director finds themselves mentally carrying operational details during rest. Attention spans and meetings shorten. Decision conversations begin lasting longer without producing any greater clarity. The same questions resurface repeatedly without finding resolution. Strategic planning conversations feel shallow because immediate operational demands keep pulling focus away from anything long term. Creative thinking diminishes not from a lack of imagination, but from insufficient margin for the kind of reflection that imagination requires. These experiences feel personal rather than organizational, which is exactly what makes them so difficult to name. Leaders who encounter them tend to interpret them as character issues, a deficit in discipline, a spiritual dryness, a resilience problem. The structural source remains invisible while the personal cost accumulates. Threshold signals also appear at the team level, and they are equally easy to misread. Staff members begin framing proposals as questions rather than conclusions. They hedge recommendations with qualifiers. They seek reassurance before acting, even when their role technically authorizes them to move. This is not indecisiveness. It is a learned response to an environment where authority has not been made clear. Over time, organizations quietly lose access to the full judgment of their teams because that judgment has been conditioned toward caution rather than confidence. And nobody designed that outcome. It developed through the accumulated effect of 1,000 small moments where clarity was not present. Threshold signals are worth taking seriously precisely because they are easy to dismiss. Leaders who are deeply committed to their organizations naturally interpret strain as a call to a greater personal effort. They work harder, they stay later, they absorb more. For a season, this response sustains momentum. Over time, it deepens the bottleneck rather than relieving it because the structural conditions that generated the strain remain in place. Proverbs 12:8 tell us, "A sensible person wins admiration for good judgment. Good judgment does not simply require wisdom, it requires margin. When decision demand exceeds the space available for thoughtful discernment, even capable and faithful leaders begin experiencing a narrowing of their judgment that they may not recognize in themselves. That narrowing is not a character failure, it is what sustained pressure on a concentrated structure eventually produces. When decision bottlenecks persist long enough, they begin reshaping the culture of an organization in ways that are very difficult to trace back to their source. Initiative decreases because teams become cautious about acting independently. Creativity narrows as energy shifts towards coordination rather than innovation. Senior leaders spend increasing amounts of time resolving operational questions instead of guiding future direction. Strategic conversations keep moving to later seasons without a clear reason why. And the mission that once felt like the animating center of the organization begins to feel like something the organization is working around rather than toward. There is a cost to mission clarity here that is easy to overlook. When senior leaders are spending the majority of their decision-making energy on logistical and operational questions, less capacity remains for the forward-looking dimensions of their calling. Churches and nonprofits that begin with a sharp and compelling sense of purpose can gradually lose that edge. Not because the purpose changed, but because the leaders responsible for carrying the vision forward no longer have the margin to tend it. Dependency replaces empowerment. Capable leaders and staff hesitate without confirmation because the boundaries of their authority have never been made clear. Organizational learning slows because decisions repeatedly return to central leadership rather than developing across teams. None of these outcomes reflect poor leadership. They reflect structural concentration that formed unintentionally, and they are rarely visible until someone looks at the system as a whole rather than at individual performance. Volunteer engagement often surfaces these pressures in particularly visible ways. Volunteers who bring genuine capacity and real passion will eventually disengage if their contributions are consistently filtered through bottlenecked approval processes. When good judgment is routinely deferred upward for confirmation, volunteers learn over time that the organization does not fully trust them to contribute independently. The result is either passive compliance or quiet departure. Neither reflects the volunteer's actual capacity or desire to serve, and the organization rarely understands what it lost. Acts 6:2 says, "We apostles should spend our time teaching the word of God, not running a food program." What is worth noticing in this moment is not the specific decision that was made, but the willingness to name what was happening before it came a crisis. The early leaders recognized that concentrated decision responsibility was consuming capacity that belonged elsewhere. That recognition came before the strain became unsustainable. That kind of honest early naming is what this module is trying to cultivate. Let me describe a few patterns that tend to repeat across different organizations when decision bottlenecks have taken root. These are not diagnoses. These are descriptions. The goal is only to help name what leaders may already be sensing. The first is the question that circulates without resolution. A topic is raised, discussed in the meeting, tabled for further consideration, and revisited in a later meeting, often arriving at the same place it started. The loop persists not because leaders lack the ability to decide, but because no one has been clearly authorized to close the question. Everyone in the loop may be acting responsibly. The process still consumes far more energy than the decision itself warrants, and few people inside it can explain exactly why it keeps recurring. The second is the gap between accountability and authority that no one has named. A program leader is responsible for delivering a ministry initiative, but does not have clear authority over the decisions required to achieve it. Every question that touches certain boundaries must travel upward. The leader is held accountable for outcomes while being structurally dependent on approvals they cannot control. This gap is one of the more common sources of quiet frustration in ministry leadership, and it rarely surfaces in performance conversations because neither party recognizes its structural origin. The third is the unowned question. A concern surfaces in a team conversation. Everyone acknowledges it as important. Weeks pass without movement. When it resurfaces, the conversation repeats. No one is avoiding the question intentionally. The absence of ownership is not negligence. It is the natural result of an organization that has not assigned resolution responsibility clearly. Over time, these unresolved questions accumulate into an invisible backlog that consumes relational energy and quietly erodes team confidence. None of these patterns are signs of a failing organization. They are signs of an organization that has grown beyond the structure it built for an earlier season and has not yet stopped to examine what the new season actually requires. Before I move toward the close, I want to offer a few questions that are worth sitting with. Which decisions in your organization consistently rise to senior leadership, regardless of their scope? Where do delays most frequently occur, and has anyone ever traced these delays back to their origin? Are leaders functioning more as interpreters of uncertainty than as guides of direction? Do teams wait for reassurance even when they are capable of acting? And if so, has anyone asked why that learned response developed? Here's one more worth considering. Think about a handful of recent decisions in your organization. Trace each one backward from resolution to origin. How many people were involved? How many conversations were required? How much time elapsed between the initial question and the final answer? The gap between how a decision flow is assumed to work and how it actually works is often larger than anyone expected. Seeing that gap clearly is not a cause for discouragement. It is the beginning of honest organizational self-awareness. These questions are not a checklist. They are an invitation to sit with what you already sense. You do not need to resolve them here. What you name honestly is already more than most organizations stop to see. 1 Corinthians 14:33 says, "For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace." Peace in leadership environments rarely emerges on its own. It tends to emerge through clarity of responsibility and decision flow, through structures that allow faithful people to serve without unnecessary strain, and through leaders who can lead from a place of genuine discernment rather than continuous operational pressure. That kind of peace is not the absence of complexity. It is what becomes possible when the structure around leadership is honest about what it actually asks of the people within it. Now, if some of what we covered today felt familiar, I want to say something we're sitting with. Decision bottlenecks rarely signal organizational weakness. More often, they reveal growth that has outpaced structural clarity. The organizations most likely to experience what we described today are not struggling organizations, they are often thriving ones. Organizations where the mission is moving, where people are committed, where genuine momentum exists. The strain is the cost of that momentum encountering a structure that was built for an earlier season. There is a meaningful difference between organizations that encounter these patterns reactively after frustration has accumulated and the dysfunction has become entrenched, and those that encounter them proactively while the organization still has the margin and the goodwill to examine them honestly. The proactive path requires attentiveness. It requires a willingness to look at how the organization actually functions rather than how it is assumed to function. And that examination is rarely comfortable to being alone. Naming what is present is meaningful. Not because naming it resolves it, but because organizations that cannot see a pattern do not do anything constructive with what they are sensing. The awareness that comes from honest observation is not the end of the conversation, it is the beginning of the one worth having. This is the kind of conversation that we at Kingdom Planning exist to support, not from outside the reality of ministry leadership, but alongside of it, within the specific history, culture, and season of each individual organization. If this conversation was useful, here are a few ways to go further. First, we have the Lead and Deliver newsletter that goes out weekly and goes deeper on topics like this one on every issue, including practical observations in a book corner that connects organizational thinking to ministry and nonprofit leadership. You can subscribe at kingdomplanning.org/newsletter. Second, we have the Kingdom Planning Leadership Clarity Field Guide, which covers these patterns in structured detail across 5 modules. This conversation was drawn from Module 4, which examines decision bottlenecks and leadership threshold signals. You can access the full guide at kingdomplanning.org and click on the Resources tab. Third, if something in today's episode prompted a more specific question about your own individual context, I would welcome a conversation. We offer a free 20-minute leadership clarity consultation for church and nonprofit leaders. There's no pressure involved, just a focused conversation about what you are actually navigating. You can schedule that at kingdomplanning.org/contact. And our hope for that discussion is just to give you some time to step back and hopefully see things clearly, maybe for the first time. Thank you for listening to the Kingdom Planning Podcast. Don't forget, take the time to step back so you can see clearly. Ask Father to help you lead courageously so that you can steward your congregation faithfully under Christ's authority. Stay blessed, and we'll see you next time.